Number 12. The valley that fed an empire until the water decided to stay. There is a place in the historical record that most people skip past. It sits in the administrative archives of ancient Mesopotamia, buried under cuneiform tablets that describe grain allocations, canal maintenance orders, and livestock counts. On its own, each tablet looks like bureaucratic noise, but when archaeologists and historians began reading them together, a picture emerged of something far more consequential than bookkeeping. It was the picture of a civilization watching its own agricultural foundation rot from the inside out, and not fully understanding what was happening until it was already done. The region in question is the lower alluvial plain of ancient Sumer, the southernmost stretch of what is now southern Iraq. Around 2200 BCE, this land was the engine of one of the most sophisticated urban cultures the ancient world had yet produced. Cities like Ur, Nippur, and Lagash were administrative centers with writing systems, legal codes, and granaries capable of feeding tens of thousands of people. The irrigation networks that fed them were elaborate, maintained by organized labor, and had been functioning in recognizable form for centuries. The canals pulled water from the Tigris and Euphrates and distributed it across fields that grew emmer wheat and barley in quantities that sustained not just the cities, but an entire political hierarchy resting on agricultural surplus. What the records begin to show, from roughly the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE onward, is a slow and deeply troubling shift in that grain production. The barley yields, which were already being tracked numerically by Sumerian administrators, began to decline. At first, the drop was gradual enough to be dismissed as seasonal variation, but the decline continued across decades. More alarming, the tablets began documenting a change in what crops were being planted at all. Barley replaced wheat in field after field, not because farmers preferred it, but because wheat could no longer survive the conditions in the soil. The mechanism behind this was not drought, it was not invasion, it was salt. When river water is drawn through irrigation canals and spread across flat alluvial land in a region with high evaporation rates and limited natural drainage, the water evaporates, but the dissolved salts it carries do not. They stay behind in the soil. Over years and decades, those salts accumulate. Eventually, the concentration rises high enough to suppress plant growth. This process, known to modern agronomists as salinization, is slow, invisible to the eye at first, and essentially irreversible on any timescale meaningful to human administration. By the time a farmer notices the soil is failing, the damage has been building for a generation. The Sumerian administrative texts are unusually clear about what happened next. Wheat yields dropped to levels that made the crop economically unviable across large portions of the cultivated plain. Barley, which is more salt-tolerant, held on longer, but also declined. The tablets from sites like Girsu show the overall grain harvest shrinking across a period spanning roughly 2 centuries. Some researchers have calculated yield drops of 60 to 70% compared to earlier benchmarks preserved in the same administrative tradition. The numbers are stark. This agricultural collapse did not happen in isolation. It coincided with the political fragmentation of the Sumerian city-state system, the weakening of centralized authority, and demographic pressure as population centers in the south became harder to feed. Some scholars are careful to note that the relationship between salinization and political collapse is correlational, and that other factors, including the broader climate disruption of the 2200 BCE period that affected civilizations from Egypt to the Indus Valley, played roles that are difficult to disentangle, but the soil data is not ambiguous. The southern Mesopotamian plain was being slowly poisoned by the very irrigation system that had made its civilization possible. What makes this flood-adjacent catastrophe so haunting is precisely its invisibility. There was no single wall of water. There was no moment of sudden destruction. There was just the quiet, annual accumulation of waterborne salt in fields that had once been the most productive in the ancient world. The farmers continued working, the administrators continued counting, and the land continued dying, one season at a time, until whole cities in the south were either abandoned or drastically reduced. The writing system that had tracked the decline survived. The civilization that created it did not fully recover in the south for centuries. The evidence did not announce itself. It just quietly stayed in the soil, waiting for someone 3,000 years later to read the tablets and understand what the numbers meant. Number 11. The river that swallowed a medieval city and was forgotten when the city was rebuilt elsewhere. In the low-lying coastal territories of what is now the the Netherlands and northwestern Germany, the medieval period was defined not by castles and crusades, but by water. The North Sea was not simply a boundary, it was a presence, a constant negotiation between human settlement and tidal reality that shaped land tenure, religious practice, tax records, and population distribution in ways that have no parallel in landlocked European history. And in November of 1287, that negotiation ended very badly. The disaster that struck the coastal communities of the region in that year is known to scholars as the St. Lucia Flood, named after the feast day on which it reached its peak destructive force. A powerful storm surge drove North Sea water inland with a force that overwhelmed the earthen dikes and coastal barriers that had been constructed over centuries of careful, community-organized labor. The flooding was catastrophic across a wide zone. The casualty estimates in later chronicles range widely, and many historians treat the higher figures with caution, but there is little dispute that thousands of people died, that extensive agricultural land was permanently inundated, and that the physical geography of the coastline was permanently altered. What the St. Lucia flood did, that is almost entirely absent from popular historical memory, is reshape the inland waterway system of the northern Netherlands in a way that changed the future of Dutch trade and maritime power. The flood did not merely destroy, it carved. The surge waters broke through coastal barriers and expanded existing inland waterways, contributing to the formation and enlargement of what would eventually become the Zuiderzee, the large inland sea that dominated the northern Dutch coastline until the 20th century, when it was finally partially reclaimed. The creation of that open water body gave medieval and early modern Dutch and Frisian merchants direct access to deeper navigation routes, effectively rewiring the commercial geography of the region. The cities that survived and adapted to the post-flood geography did so by rebuilding on higher ground, by reorganizing their relationship to the new waterways, and by investing in more sophisticated dike technology. The communities that could not adapt were simply gone, their locations sometimes marked today only by a church tower visible at low tide, or a name preserved in local records, with the word sunken attached to it. Some of these drowned settlements are known to archaeology, their outlines visible in aerial surveys of the tidal flats, their artifacts occasionally surfacing after storms. The administrative records that survive from this period are fragmentary. Church records, land registers, and episcopal correspondence all document the disruption, but the coherent picture of what was lost requires assembling sources from multiple ecclesiastical and civic archives, many of which were themselves damaged or displaced by subsequent flooding events in the following century. What emerges is the image of a coastline in permanent flux, where communities had learned to accept a certain level of inundation as normal, but had never encountered anything at this scale within living memory. The deeper consequence of the St. Lucia flood is one that almost no general history book discusses. By permanently altering the coastal morphology of the northern Netherlands, the flood indirectly contributed to the conditions that made Amsterdam's later rise possible. The new inland sea and its connecting waterways created a transportation and trade infrastructure that communities in the western Netherlands could exploit. The shift in commercial gravity toward the western ports, a shift that would eventually produce one of the most powerful maritime trading civilizations of the 17th century, had one of its earliest physical causes in a storm surge that killed thousands of people in the winter of 1287, and then vanished almost entirely from the historical consciousness of the civilization it helped create. The water that took everything from one generation quietly handed the next generation a sea road. Number 10. The flood that ended a dynasty, but was recorded as a sign from heaven rather than a weather event. There is a chronicle entry from the reign of the later Zhou dynasty in China, dating to the 8th century BCE, that describes an extraordinary natural event along the Wei River Valley in what is now Shanxi province. The rivers that fed the agricultural heartland of the western Zhou state were behaving abnormally. The Jing, Wei, and Luo rivers, all tributaries that drained into the basin sustaining the Zhou capital region, were reported to have experienced dramatic changes in their flow. Ancient Chinese chronicles, including the Shiji compiled centuries later by Sima Qian, preserve accounts of earthquakes in the region around 780 BCE, and subsequent alterations to river courses that rendered previously reliable water sources unreachable and left other areas inundated. The western Zhou state by this period was already under significant stress. Its political authority over the various regional lords had been declining for generations, and the royal house was managing a territory far more fractious than the unified realm its founders had governed. But the hydrological disruption that struck the Wei River system in the late 9th and early 8th centuries BCE was not simply a metaphor for political decline. It was a material catastrophe that struck at the agricultural foundation of royal power. The Wei River Valley was one of the most productive grain-growing regions in early China. The Zhou kings drew their revenue, their labor surplus, and their military provisioning capacity from the agricultural output of that valley. When the river system was disrupted, whether by earthquake-induced changes to the landscape, by exceptional flood events, or by some combination of both, the consequences for crop production were direct and severe. Fields that had been reliably watered by predictable seasonal flooding were either cut off from water entirely or buried under sediment deposits that required years of work to clear. What Chinese historical sources do with this is characteristic of early court historiography everywhere. They record the events not as hydraulic disasters requiring engineering solutions, but as cosmological signals, evidence that the ruling house had lost the moral authority to govern, that heaven was withdrawing its mandate. The earthquake of 780 BCE is specifically referenced in later texts as a portent of the dynasty's fall. The river changes are framed in terms of spiritual disorder rather than physical cause and effect. This framing had real consequences for how the court responded. Rather than organizing large-scale hydraulic repair and agricultural recovery efforts, which the Zhou administrative system was theoretically capable of doing, the court focused on ritual responses, divination, and political recalibration. The material crisis was real, the interpretation of it was theological, and the gap between those two things is part of what made recovery so slow. By 771 BCE, under circumstances that involved both internal political conflict and pressure from Western peoples identified in the sources as the Quanrong, the western Zhou capital in the Wei Valley, was sacked and the king killed. The court relocated east to Luoyi, near modern Luoyang, beginning the period historians call the Eastern Zhou. The move was presented in historical memory as a political and military retreat, but the physical and agricultural degradation of the Wei Valley, driven in part by the hydraulic disasters of the preceding decades, made that valley a far less viable seat of royal power than it had been a century earlier. The flood that helped hollow out a dynasty was filed under the wrong category and has stayed there ever since. Number 9. The inundation that wiped a trading port from the map and left only its name in a rival's records. The eastern coast of England in the medieval period was dotted with port towns that no longer exist, not abandoned, not relocated, submerged. The combination of coastal erosion, storm surge, and the gradual geological process of land subsidence along the East Anglian coast consumed a series of functioning towns over a period running roughly from the 12th through the 15th centuries. Of these, the most historically significant and the most comprehensively erased is the town of Dunwich in Suffolk. At its height, Dunwich was one of the largest and most commercially active ports on the eastern English coast. It maintained a significant fishing fleet, conducted trade across the North Sea with Flemish and Hanseatic merchants, and was important enough to send representatives to early English parliaments. It paid substantial taxes, suggesting a population and commercial volume that placed it among the significant towns of medieval England. Its church infrastructure was extensive. Its harbor was one of the busiest on the Suffolk coast. The sea had always been a problem for Dunwich. The town sat on a stretch of coastline made of glacially deposited clays and gravels, materials that erode relatively quickly under sustained wave action. The local authorities and landowners were aware of the threat and made periodic efforts to maintain harbor works and coastal defenses, but the storms of the late 13th and early 14th centuries were exceptional in their intensity and frequency, and they exceeded whatever protective capacity the town's infrastructure could provide. The Great Storm of 1286 and the subsequent storms of the early 14th century delivered repeated blows to the harbor entrance, gradually sealing it with accumulated sand and shingle. Without a functioning harbor, the economic rationale for the town collapsed. Trade could not continue. The fishing fleet could not operate effectively. Merchants and skilled craftspeople began relocating to rival ports, like Southwold and Blythburgh, taking their capital, their connections, and their commercial networks with them. The population contracted. The tax returns declined. The town that had once competed for regional commercial dominance was reduced within a few generations to a shrinking remnant clinging to an eroding cliff edge. Over the following centuries, storm after storm chewed away at what remained. Churches fell into the sea, streets disappeared, the cliff retreated at rates that contemporary accounts found difficult to believe. By the early modern period, Dunwich was a small village attached to a ruin. Today, almost nothing visible remains above the waterline. Acoustic surveys of the seabed off the Suffolk coast have mapped the outlines of submerged structures, and periodic low tides expose fragments of medieval masonry. Local legend, probably embellished but grounded in real memory, insists that on quiet nights you can hear the bells of the sunken churches ringing beneath the water. What is historically significant about Dunwich is not just that it disappeared, it is that it disappeared from memory so thoroughly that even its former scale is underappreciated. The commercial weight it carried in the 12th and 13th centuries meant that its removal from the map genuinely shifted trade patterns along the East Anglian coast, redistributing commercial traffic to its surviving rivals in ways that shaped their subsequent growth. The flood-driven erosion of Dunwich was not an isolated tragedy, it was a competitive elimination, one whose winners preferred not to dwell on the circumstances of their advantage. The record of what Dunwich was survives mainly because other towns needed to note what it owed and what it was no longer capable of paying. Number 8. The dam collapse that nobody upstream knew had already happened when the second wave arrived. In September of 1887, the Yellow River in northern China exceeded its containment banks and flooded the agricultural plain of Henan province in what became one of the deadliest flood events in recorded human history. Most accounts of this disaster focus on its scale, and the scale was genuinely staggering. Contemporary and later estimates of the death toll have ranged from hundreds of thousands to nearly 1 million people, though modern researchers treat the higher figures with appropriate caution given the difficulties of documentation in a region where entire communities were obliterated and administrative systems temporarily ceased to function. But the mechanism of the 1887 Yellow River flood is less discussed than its death toll, and the mechanism reveals something important about why it was so catastrophic. The Yellow River earns its name from the extraordinary volume of loess sediment it carries. Loess is an extremely fine, wind-deposited soil that blankets vast areas of the Chinese interior. The Yellow River cuts through loess country for much of its course, picking up sediment in quantities that have no real parallel among major world rivers. That sediment load has a specific hydraulic consequence. It deposits on the riverbed. Over centuries, the bed of the Yellow River and its lower reaches rises, and the river is forced to rise with it. Successive generations of farmers and administrators have responded by building the levees higher, creating a river that in some stretches runs at a level significantly above the surrounding plain. The river does not flow through the landscape, it flows above it, contained by earthen walls that represent centuries of accumulated human labor. This arrangement is inherently catastrophic in its failure mode. When a levee in an elevated river system fails, the water does not merely flood outward, it pours downward onto a plain that sits below the river surface, and it pours with a hydraulic pressure proportional to the height differential. In 1887, the levee failure near Zhengjian released not just the river's current, but the accumulated depth of an elevated river course onto a plain populated by tens of millions of subsistence farmers who had almost no vertical elevation to retreat to and almost no warning system that could have reached them in time. The secondary disasters compounded the initial inundation. Fields were buried under silt, drinking water was contaminated, grain stores that had not yet been harvested were destroyed. The disruption to agricultural production created famine conditions that extended the death toll well beyond the flood itself into the following months and year. Villages were entirely gone, their locations marked only by the muddy surface of what had become a temporary inland lake stretching across thousands of square kilometers. The political context matters here. The Qing dynasty in 1887 was in an advanced state of institutional stress. The resources available for flood relief, levee repair, and agricultural recovery were limited by the state's competing financial obligations, including debt repayments to foreign powers following the conflicts of the mid-19th century. The repair of the Yellow River levee system after 1887 was slow, underfunded, and incomplete. The river flooded again in 1898. It flooded catastrophically again in 1931. The pattern of elevated riverbed, aging levees, underfunded maintenance, and catastrophic failure repeated itself across generations because the underlying hydraulic reality had never been addressed, only patched. The 1887 flood does not appear in most Western historical consciousness, despite its scale. The erasure is partly geographic and partly temporal. It sits in a period of Chinese history that Western historical education tends to skip over, and it lacks the narrative anchor that Western audiences might find familiar. But by any measure of human consequence, it belongs among the most significant single disasters of the 19th century. Number 7. The flood that a government deliberately created and then spent decades pretending had been natural. In the summer of 1938, Japanese military forces had advanced deep into central China and were approaching the city of Wuhan along the railway lines running through Henan province. The nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek, facing an enemy with superior firepower and mechanized logistics, was running out of conventional military options to slow the advance. A decision was made at the highest levels of the government, a decision that its makers understood would cause massive civilian casualties, to breach the Yellow River levees at Huayuankou, north of Zhengzhou. The breach was carried out by nationalist engineering units in June of 1938. The river, already running high with seasonal rainfall, poured through the gap with the full hydraulic force of an elevated watercourse, releasing onto a plain below it. The flood spread across Henan, Anhui, and Jiangsu provinces, inundating an area that some estimates place at over 50,000 square kilometers. The Japanese advance along the Longhai Railway was halted. The military objective was achieved, at least temporarily. The civilian cost was extraordinary. The population of the affected region was dense, agricultural, and entirely unprepared. The nationalist government did not announce the breach to the civilian population in advance, in part because doing so might have revealed the military operation to Japanese intelligence, and in part because the announcement would have required the government to take explicit public ownership of a decision to deliberately flood its own people. The water moved faster than any warning could have traveled. Villages were swallowed. Families drowned in their homes. People who survived the initial flood found themselves stranded in a landscape where all landmarks had disappeared. Estimates of the civilian death toll from the Huayuankou flood vary significantly across sources and have been subject to political pressure from multiple directions. The figure most commonly cited by historians ranges from several hundred thousand to potentially close to 1 million, though establishing a precise number is complicated by the fact that flood deaths and subsequent famine and disease deaths are difficult to separate, and by the fact that the nationalist government had strong incentives to suppress or minimize documentation. For decades after the event, the official account presented the breach as having been caused by Japanese bombing, a version of events that was maintained in nationalist-controlled media and carried into the historical record in ways that persisted even after the deliberate nature of the breach became clear to researchers. The flood created a new course for the Yellow River that persisted for 9 years, until 1947, when repair work finally redirected the river back toward its previous channel. During those 9 years, the flooded plain remained partially inundated and largely agriculturally devastated, creating conditions for continued hunger and population displacement on a massive scale. The region took decades to recover. The Huayuankou flood is one of the clearest examples in the historical record of water being used as a weapon against a civilian population, presented afterward as something other than what it was, and then gradually fading from the international historical consciousness, even as its consequences shaped the lives of millions of people in central China for a generation. The water was deliberate, the silence about it was also deliberate, and both of them worked. Number 6. The coastal inundation that killed more people than the battle that everyone remembers from the same year. In November of 1099, a storm surge struck the low-lying coastline of the southern North Sea with a force that contemporary chronicles in England, France, and the Low Countries struggled to describe in language adequate to the destruction. The event is documented in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in monastic records from coastal English monasteries, and in scattered references in Norman and Flemish documentary sources. It is often referred to by historians as the All Saints' Flood, or the November 1099 flood, named after the approximate timing relative to the liturgical calendar. The year 1099 is remembered in Western historical consciousness for one thing: the First Crusade, and specifically the capture of Jerusalem in July of that year. The siege, the assault, the fall of the city, and the extremely violent aftermath are among the most documented military events of the medieval period and have been the subject of continuous historical analysis and cultural recapitulation for 9 centuries. The flood that struck the North Sea coasts 4 months later has received almost none of that attention. The coastal communities affected by the November 1099 storm surge were among the most densely settled in northwestern Europe. The Low Countries, the eastern English coast, and the coastal zones of what is now northwestern France all contained concentrations of agricultural and fishing communities whose entire economic existence was organized around proximity to tidal water. Their defenses were the earthen dikes and ridges that communities had been building and maintaining for generations. Structures that were adequate for ordinary tidal fluctuation but could not withstand a storm surge of the magnitude that the November gale produced. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle entry for 1099 is unusually specific about the flooding of coastal lands, the deaths in tidal communities, and the destruction of cultivated fields. Monastic records from institutions like those at Romney Marsh in Kent document the loss of reclaimed agricultural land on a scale that took years to remediate. In the Low Countries, the evidence is preserved in land records that document the abandonment of previously assessed and taxed agricultural holdings, the standard administrative fingerprint of land that has been rendered unworkable. The death toll from the 1099 storm surge is not knowable with precision. Medieval chroniclers were not conducting demographic surveys, but the documented scale of land loss, the geographic spread of the event across multiple national territories, and the density of population in the affected coastal zones all point toward a casualty figure that, in aggregate across the affected coastline, was substantial enough to alter local population distribution, church revenue patterns, and agricultural productivity for years afterward. What the 1099 flood demonstrates is a consistent feature of how historical memory distributes attention. Events that have clear protagonists, legible political narratives, and emotional weight attached to named individuals get remembered. Events that kill large numbers of unnamed agricultural workers through impersonal natural forces get a single line in a chronicle, if they get anything at all. The Crusaders who reached Jerusalem left names, accounts, and a narrative that Western civilization chose to perpetuate. The people who drowned in their coastal fields 4 months later left only a note about unusually high water, buried in a document most historians encounter only by accident. Number 5. The flood nobody was warned about because the warning system had been quietly dismantled to save money. On May 31st, 1889, the South Fork Dam above Johnstown in Cambria County, Pennsylvania, failed after days of heavy rainfall had pushed the reservoir behind it to capacity. The wall of water released by the dam collapse traveled down the Conemaugh Valley at speeds that, in the confined channel of the valley, reached estimates of around 40 kilometers per hour. When it struck Johnstown, a steel mill town of approximately 30,000 people, it killed somewhere between 2,000 and 2,200 of them within minutes. The flood debris piled up against a stone railroad bridge at the lower end of town, caught fire, and burned while people were still trapped inside it. The Johnstown flood is not, strictly speaking, forgotten. It has a national memorial, a considerable documentary record, and a place in American disaster history that has been maintained by local historical societies and writers since the event itself. But the aspect of it that deserves deeper examination, and that tends to get compressed into brief mentions even in accounts that know about it, is the specific history of how the dam's safety systems were degraded in the years before the failure. The South Fork Dam had been constructed by the state of Pennsylvania in the 1850s to supply water to a canal system that was already obsolete by the time the dam was finished because the railroads had destroyed the commercial viability of the canals. The dam was subsequently sold, neglected, and eventually acquired by the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, a private organization whose membership included some of the most wealthy and influential individuals in Pennsylvania, including figures from the Carnegie and Mellon industrial networks. The club made several modifications to the dam that compromised its structural integrity. The discharge pipes that allowed controlled release of excess water were removed, reportedly for salvage value. The spillway was partially obstructed with fish screens to prevent the stocked fish in the reservoir from escaping, and its capacity was reduced. The dam crest was lowered slightly to allow carriage traffic across it. Each of these modifications, taken individually, might have been defensible. Taken together, they eliminated the safety margins that the dam would have needed to survive the June 1889 rainfall event. Local engineers had expressed concern about the dam's condition in the years before the failure. A railroad engineer named John Park, who was present at the dam on the day of the failure, tried to warn Johnstown by riding to South Fork and sending telegraphs down the valley. The warnings reached some people in Johnstown. They were not believed with sufficient urgency, in part because the dam had been the subject of concern before and had not failed. The population of the valley valley had effectively been desensitized to the warning by years of the danger failing to materialize. After the flood, lawsuits against the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club were brought by survivors and families of the dead. Every one of them failed. The club's members faced no legal accountability. The legal doctrine of act of God was successfully applied in court proceedings to shield the private owners of a structure that had been negligently modified from any financial obligation to the people killed downstream. The record preserves the legal outcome. What it cannot preserve is what it felt like to live downstream of a structure that wealthy men had quietly made less safe, and then never told anyone about. Number 4. The slow inundation that convinced an entire civilization to abandon writing for 3 centuries. Around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean world collapsed. This statement, which scholars refer to as the Late Bronze Age collapse, is one of the most discussed and contested events in ancient history precisely because its causes remain genuinely uncertain and probably multiple. The palace civilizations of Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, the Egyptian presence in Canaan, and a series of other interconnected state systems all failed or contracted severely within a period of roughly 50 years. Writing systems disappeared in some regions. Trade networks that had operated across the entire Eastern Mediterranean were severed. Urban populations contracted sharply. Some cities were burned and abandoned. The Bronze Age, defined by its palace economies, its long-distance metal trade, and its literate bureaucracies, effectively ended. Among the proposed causes of this collapse, the one that has received sustained attention from climate scientists and archaeologists in recent years is drought. Paleoclimate evidence drawn from sediment cores, pollen analysis, and speleothem records from multiple sites across the Eastern Mediterranean suggests a significant, multi-decadal drought episode beginning sometime around 1200 BCE. The evidence is strongest for the Levantine coast and Anatolia, and somewhat less consistent across the full geographic range of the collapse. But the drought signal is real, and it is beginning to be correlated with the documentary record. What the drought argument specifically connects to flooding is indirect but important. The palace economy civilizations of the Late Bronze Age were finely calibrated to specific agricultural outputs. They maintained grain stores, managed redistributive food systems, and sustained large non-agricultural specialist populations including soldiers, craftspeople, scribes, and administrators on the basis of those stores. When rainfall patterns shifted and agricultural yields declined over a period of years, the stored surplus that kept the system running was consumed without being replenished. The palace systems began to fail not with a single dramatic event, but with the slow drainage of the reserves that had insulated them from short-term climate variability. The flooding dimension of this story appears in the archaeological record of coastal sites. Some researchers studying the period have noted evidence of catastrophic flooding events at specific coastal locations in the Eastern Mediterranean around this period, potentially related to seismic activity and tsunamis associated with the high level of geological instability in the region. The destruction layers at Ugarit, one of the best documented Bronze Age cities, show evidence of rapid violent destruction followed by permanent abandonment. The exact cause of Ugarit's destruction is debated, with fire, earthquake, and military attack all proposed, but the abandonment was total and permanent. What the broader collapse destroyed was not just cities, it destroyed the administrative and intellectual infrastructure of literate civilization in the Aegean. Linear B, the writing system used by Mycenaean palace administrators, disappeared entirely when the palaces that had created it and had the only specialists trained to use it were destroyed. Greece did not have a functional writing system for approximately 3 centuries, until the adoption of the Phoenician alphabet in the early Iron Age. 3 centuries of Greek experience, memory, and culture were never written down. Whatever those generations knew, built, argued about, and lost, it was gone before anyone could record it. The collapse that erased writing from Greece was not a single flood. It was the compounded pressure of drought, displacement, seismic activity, disrupted trade, and agricultural failure. A slow catastrophe that looked different from every point inside it and only revealed its true shape when viewed from the outside, centuries later. Number 3. The flood that moved a river, erased a border, and triggered a war that lasted a generation. The Rio Grande forms one of the longest international land borders in the world, running for nearly 3,000 kilometers between the United States and Mexico. For a river being used as a political boundary, the Rio Grande has a hydraulic problem that its function as a border makes genuinely dangerous. It moves. Rivers and alluvial valleys shift their channels over time through the process of lateral migration and periodic avulsion, and when a river's position defines an international boundary, every channel shift is simultaneously a geopolitical event. The most serious episode of this problem in the history of the Rio Grande border produced a dispute known as the Chamizal controversy, which began in 1864 and was not formally resolved until 1963, nearly a century later. The cause of the dispute was a flood event in 1864 in which the Rio Grande shifted its channel southward, adding a piece of land called El Chamizal, approximately 600 acres of territory near the city of El Paso, to the north bank of the river, and therefore, under the logic of the existing border treaty, to American territory. The relevant treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848 following the Mexican-American War, specified that the boundary between the two countries in the El Paso region followed the center of the Rio Grande's channel. The treaty was clear. The problem was that nobody had anticipated the river moving. The flood of 1864 did not just reshape a riverbank. It raised a question that two national governments, multiple courts, an international arbitration tribunal, and decades of diplomacy were unable to answer to both parties' satisfaction. Which rule applied when the river that was the border moved? Mexico argued that the shift had been caused by a sudden avulsion, a rapid channel migration during a flood event, and that under international law, the boundary should remain where it had been before the flood. Since sudden avulsion events were generally considered not to transfer sovereignty, the United States argued that the boundary was simply wherever the river currently was, and that El Chamizal was therefore American territory. Both arguments had legal grounding. Neither could be definitively disproven by the available evidence, in part because the exact mechanics of the 1864 channel shift, whether it was gradual erosion or sudden avulsion, had not been documented with the precision that would later be required by international arbitrators. The dispute persisted through arbitration in 1911, which found partially in Mexico's favor, but whose outcome the United States declined to implement. It was not resolved until the 1963 Chamizal Convention, under Presidents Kennedy and Lopez Mateos, which divided the disputed territory, involved the relocation of thousands of residents on both sides of the adjusted border, required the concrete channelization of the Rio Grande in the affected area to prevent future movement, and became part of a broader diplomatic normalization between the two countries. A single flood event in 1864, whose precise mechanics will never be fully established, created a 99-year international dispute. The flood did not just move water, it moved a boundary, and boundaries, once moved by water, turn out to be extraordinarily difficult to move back. Number 2. The inundation that killed more people than any other single natural disaster in the 20th century and was suppressed in every official record for decades. In the summer of 1931, China experienced a convergence of meteorological conditions of a kind that even a well-functioning modern state with contemporary warning technology would have struggled to manage. The previous 2 years had seen unusual rainfall patterns across central China, and the winter of 1930 to 1931 had produced exceptional snowfall in the river headwater regions. When the spring melt began, and was followed by an unusually wet summer monsoon season, the three great river systems of central China, the Yellow River, the Huai River, and the Yangtze, all flooded simultaneously. The scale of what followed is almost impossible to render in terms that feel proportionate to the reality. The flooded area covered somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 square kilometers, depending on how the boundaries of inundation are defined and which phase of the flooding is being measured. The Yangtze rose to levels that breached its levees at multiple points. The Han River, a major tributary, contributed additional surge. The city of Wuhan was inundated for months. Lake Gaoyu in Jiangsu, when its protective embankments failed in August, sent a surge of water across densely populated low-lying agricultural land in the middle of the night, a nighttime surge that eliminated any chance the sleeping population had of reaching higher ground. Death toll estimates for the 1931 floods range widely. Contemporary reports from international observers and relief organizations placed the immediate death toll in the hundreds of thousands. When famine and disease deaths, particularly from cholera and typhoid in the months following the flood, are included, some estimates have reached figures in excess of 3 million. The historian Micah Muscolino and others who have worked specifically on the 1931 disaster have engaged seriously with the demographic and archival evidence. A figure between 1 and 4 million total deaths, including subsequent famine, is what the range of serious historical scholarship currently supports. Though the uncertainty is genuine and acknowledged, the suppression of the disaster's true scale began almost immediately. The nationalist government, which was simultaneously managing military campaigns against communist forces and dealing with Japanese pressure in Manchuria, had strong political incentives to minimize the visible severity of the domestic crisis. International relief efforts, coordinated partly through the National Flood Relief Commission, received enough cooperation to function, but not enough to fully document the scale of what was happening in the most severely affected rural areas. Journalists who did travel into the flooded zones produced reports that were striking but could not reach the full depth of a catastrophe unfolding across an area the size of England. After 1949, the People's Republic of China had its own reasons to manage the historical memory of nationalist-era catastrophes carefully, and the 1931 floods received documentary treatment that was shaped by political considerations on multiple sides. International awareness of the event faded as the century progressed and as the disasters that followed, including the deliberate Huaiwanku breach in 1938 and the famine of the early 1960s, created additional layers of catastrophe that competed for attention and historical energy. The 1931 floods are, by the most defensible estimates, the deadliest natural disaster event of the 20th century. They receive a fraction of the historical attention given to events of comparable or lesser scale in Western countries. What killed those millions of people was not a failure of nature to give warning. The river levels rose over days and weeks. The warnings were legible to anyone watching the water. What failed was the capacity of a fractured, under-resourced, politically besieged government to translate the visible evidence of rising water into protection for the people living on the plain below it. The record of what the water did survives in archives. What does not survive is the voice of the people on the plain when they understood, in the middle of a summer night, that the embankment behind them had just given way. Number 1. The prehistoric flood that may have ended the world that came before history and left its memory in every culture that followed. There is a layer of sediment, approximately 3 to 4 meters below the surface, that excavators working at the ancient site of Ur in southern Mesopotamia encountered in the 1920s. The excavation was led by the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley, working for a joint expedition of the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania, when his workmen broke through the uppermost layers of the archaeological deposit and found a thick band of clean, water-laid alluvial clay containing no artifacts, no ash, no organic material, and no evidence of human occupation. The first reasonable interpretation was that they had reached virgin soil, the geological bottom beneath which there was nothing human. Woolley had the instinct to keep digging. Below the clay band, they found artifacts again. Human occupation resumed beneath the flood layer. People had lived in that place before the water came, and people had lived there after, and between the two occupation periods was a deposit of clean silt that had no explanation other than a flood of exceptional depth and duration. Woolley's announcement of this finding produced immediate and intense public interest because of its apparent connection to the biblical flood narrative. He was careful in his academic publications to avoid overstating the connection, but the possibility that the Ur flood deposit represented a real historical event underlying the Mesopotamian flood myths, particularly the Epic of Gilgamesh and its flood narrative, which predates the biblical version and is clearly its antecedent, entered the public imagination and has stayed there. The geological and archaeological evidence for a major flood event in Lower Mesopotamia, probably during the Ubaid period somewhere between approximately 5,000 and 6,000 years ago, is real. Similar alluvial clay deposits have been found at other Mesopotamian sites, including Kish, Shuruppak, and Farah, though they do not all date to the same episode, which suggests that the lower Mesopotamian plain experienced multiple major flood events, rather than a single universal one. The absence of a single synchronous flood layer across all sites is important. It argues against a single global catastrophe and toward a series of regionally devastating events that accumulated in the cultural memory of the communities that survived them. The more geologically ambitious version of the story involves the Black Sea. In the late 1990s, Oceanographers William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed, on the basis of seabed core samples and shoreline analysis, that the Black Sea had experienced a catastrophic saltwater inundation from the Mediterranean through the Bosporus at some point around 7,000 years ago. Their hypothesis held that before this event, the Black Sea had been a large freshwater lake, sitting at a level substantially below the Mediterranean. When the natural barrier at the Bosporus was breached, they argued, saltwater poured in at a rate that flooded the shoreline continuously and relentlessly over a period of months to years, ultimately raising the lake level by well over 100 meters and inundating a vast area of previously inhabited shoreline. The Ryan and Pittman hypothesis remains contested. Subsequent work by other oceanographers and geologists has produced evidence both supporting and complicating their timeline and mechanism. The question of whether there was a rapid catastrophic inundation or a more gradual filling is not yet resolved to universal satisfaction in the scientific literature. What is less contested is that the Black Sea shoreline did change dramatically during the post-glacial period as sea levels rose globally, and that areas of what is now the Black Sea seafloor were indeed inhabited by human communities before they were submerged. If even the more modest version of this story is correct, the implications for early human population distribution in the region around the Black Sea basin are significant. The communities living on the shores of a freshwater lake in a fertile, well-watered basin would have had to abandon their settlements as the shoreline advanced. Whether that advance was sudden or gradual, the result was the same. An inhabited landscape became seafloor. The people who survived carried the memory of what had been taken. The Mesopotamian flood myths, the earliest versions of which are preserved in Sumerian cuneiform text and are substantially older than their biblical parallels, describe a flood sent by the gods that covered the world, a single survivor preserved by divine instruction, and the eventual recession of the waters. The Epic of Gilgamesh preserves a version of this story in the account of Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who tells his story to Gilgamesh in the city of Shuruppak, one of the sites where archaeologists found a flood deposit in the actual ground beneath the ancient city. The Atrahasis Epic, another Akkadian text, contains a similar narrative. These stories were not invented from nothing. They grew from something, from the accumulated weight of real flooding events experienced by real people, compressed and mythologized, and passed down through oral tradition until the invention of writing gave them a permanent form. What is most striking about this entry is not the geological hypothesis, fascinating and contested as it is the simpler and more verifiable observation that a civilization which developed writing in part to track grain, cattle, and administrative debt used some of its earliest literary energy to record a memory of water that had come and covered everything. The oldest version of the flood story that we possess was not written as theology or cosmology, it was written as memory. Something had happened to the people who lived in the flatland between the rivers. The water had come from a direction they had not expected, at a scale that was not survivable for most of them, and changed the landscape of their world permanently. They wrote it down when they finally had the tools to write, and in every subsequent culture that inherited the story, from Babylon to ancient Greece, to the Hebrew scriptures, to the Quran, to the flood narratives of South Asian and indigenous American traditions, a version of the same memory persisted, not because the same event reached all of them, but because water is the one force that every civilization that has ever lived near a river or a coast has confronted, survived, and needed to remember. The first flood in the ledger is the one that left no chronicle, no survivor's name, no administrative record. It left only the clay, pressed between two layers of human life, and the story that would not stop being told. Of all the floods in this list, one characteristic unites them. The people who survived did not fully understand what they had just lived through, and the people who came after did not fully understand what they had inherited. Tell us in the comments which entry you think has been most thoroughly erased from the history most people are taught. If you want to go deeper into the catastrophes that shape the world no one remembers, subscribe to the Catastrophe Ledger.